Paris was never her city, but light was. She grew up under the northern sky, in a Germany of iron schedules and Protestant thrift, the daughter of an industrialist who believed in timetables, tall ledgers, and ships that left harbour on time. Her name was Hélène Müller, then later Hélène Kröller-Müller, and if you had asked the young woman what she wanted from life, she might have said, steadiness, a house, well-run, children who slept through the night. She did not arrive with a manifesto. She arrived with a sensibility order, attention, and a stubborn conviction that beauty, once it takes hold, obligates you. She married a man who understood timetables too. Anton Kroller was all forward motion, a builder of networks and fortunes, quick to judge, quicker to act. His world was shipping and trade contracts and coal grain and ore moving like weather across the North Sea. Hélène stepped into that world of numbers and schedules with a calm that surprised him. She did not compete with his velocity. She countered it with gravity. When she encountered art, truly encountered it, it was not a hobby she discovered, but a vocation that discovered her. The door opened through a teacher. He was an art advisor, with severe opinions and the charisma of a true believer, a man who could stand before a canvas and persuade a room that their lives would be smaller without it. In his classes she learned a new way of looking, not for verisimilitude, but for necessity, not for prettiness, but for presence. He did not tell her what to buy so much as train her eye to notice when a picture had a pulse. The first time she stood in front of a Van Gogh, the lesson returned to her body, as a shock here was not a painting, but a person who had insisted on existing in paint, a life-will thickened into color. She felt herself recognized, and recognition can be frightening. It changes what you think you owe. She began to collect slowly, almost shyly, a drawing to live with to test one's appetite for the discipline of looking. Then another, and another. Anton's money moved as ships do in bulk. Helene's attention moved in increments, one work at a time, until a pattern formed a reputation, a room that could no longer hold all it had learned. She did not trade. She did not speculate. She assembled a conversation she wanted to keep hearing. If she had a bias, it was for artists who painted as if the stakes were spiritual. Soon the force that kept returning her to the table was a Dutchman, with rough gestures and a tenderness the world had not known how to meet while he was alive. She understood Van Gogh not as an ornament to hang above polite conversations, but as a witness to be protected from them. He had written with paint because other languages kept failing. He had argued in sunflowers and wheatfields and night skies because ordinary sentences would not carry the heat. What Hélène recognized first as instinct, then as duty, was that a culture can lose a person twice, once when it fails them in life, and again when it disperses what remains. Allow 100 canvases to scatter to 100 walls, and you convert an urgency into decor. Keep them together, and you preserve the voice. That was the beginning of her saving. She bought early and often before consensus had congealed, before the market made piety easy. She did not choose the showpieces alone. She chose drawings, where the hand searched canvases, where the judgment was still forming themes he worried, like prayer beads, sowers, roads, fields, under a weather that behaved like fate. She kept his voice in sequence. A museum can be a chorus. A great collection is a diary. Her ambition was not to own Van Gogh, but to shelter him from dispersal long enough that the world would finally hear what he was saying. There were other artists on her walls. She was no zealot, and her appetite was Catholic in the old sense, wide and serious. She saw the strict music in Seurat, the stern light in Mondrian, the radical honesty in artists who refused to flatter the eye. She listened to sculpture that still smelled of the quarry, to drawings that looked like thinking. But the man who would be saved, that was Vincent. Around her, Europe faltered. The new century was made of declarations. Machines would solve hunger. Empires would last forever. Markets would regulate themselves. Art would triumph, because progress always does. Then came the war to end all wars, and the shortage that followed the shortage not only of flour and fuel, but of confidence. In that atmosphere, she did something that people later called stubborn, and which at the time felt to her like a refusal to be panicked. She kept buying for the future. She was not naive. She understood ledgers. The business that fed the household could rattle under forces. No one controlled freight rates, tariffs, bad weather, bad men. She watched the company swing from windfall to crisis and back again, and learned how quickly certainty bruises. She knew that at any moment prudence would argue for liquidation, for selling what was portable and precious, to rescue what was heavy and sunk. Prudence had its case. She listened to it, then did not obey. Others could save the ships. Her task was to prevent a different kind of shipwreck, a life in paint ground down into assets. To collect is a verb that can hide bad habits, acquisitiveness, the pathology of having. Hélène did not hide. She wrote, she lectured, she opened her houses, she insisted that looking was a civic duty, not a private luxury. She asked the men who ran the firm to grant workers time and space to see art as if it mattered, and she brought the paintings to them when they had no way to come to the paintings. She planned classrooms as well as galleries. She did not tarry in the role of a lady with taste. She began to behave like a founder. Founders have dreams that look at first unreasonable. She dreamed a museum out in the woods where the light would be honest and the distractions few. She hired an architect with a gift for noble clarity. She walked plots with him and talked about how walls should teach. In the middle of construction, the world's finances hiccuped, then buckled. The grand plan paused. She learned the educations that only crisis can teach, which friends are weatherproof, which promises can outlast a quarter, how stubborn a dream has to be to survive arithmetic. The museum did not vanish. It withdrew and waited for a better season. Meanwhile, the collection thickened into reputation. Scholars visited and argued, their voices raising as intellectuals' voices do when stakes are artistic but feel theological. Curators tested their courage in her rooms. Could they see without comforting labels? Could they let a painting be difficult without dragging it toward consensus? She enjoyed their discomforts, not because she liked superiority, she distrusted it in others and in herself, but because she understood that learning announces itself first as disorientation. If no one exits, a gallery changed, the gallery squandered its square meters. Her marriage, like most, that last was a sequence of repairs. Anton was brilliant and proud, and so was she. Their difficulties were not secrets. Houses have ways of speaking. He needed results. She needed reason. He needed to win. She needed to be right. They loved each other. Through the argument most couples never finish. What is the world? For his answer ebbed and flowed with the graphs of the business. Hers hardened into a sentence. She would use different words to say for the rest of her life the world, even when it lies, ultimately wants truth. Truth in her vocabulary was not a doctrine but a calibration. You tuned a museum the way you tune a violin, until it could carry the line without breaking the nerves of the players. She believed in daylight in proportion, in benches that honored fatigue without rewarding boredom. She believed in labels that told what a visitor needed to know without story stealing. She believed in putting difficult canvases where they could not be avoided, and loved works where they could be properly grieved. She paid attention to the temperature of the rooms and the temperature of the arguments about the rooms. The more closely she watched Van Gogh, the more she understood his steadiness. The myth everyone prefers is mania, a man agitated to the point of genius painting as a symptom color as fever. That fable lets us off the hook. If he was an accident, we owe him only pity. She saw the discipline, instead the daily walks, the carrying of canvas and easel to fields, not chosen for romance but for work, the conversations with other painters that left correspondence like scaffolding, the reworking, the humility that accepts a painting's refusal and tries again with different weather. Sorrow is in the paintings, yes, but so is procedure. She learned from him that survival has a technique. To save a voice, you must save its range. She did not harvest only starry nights. She kept the awkward studies, the patient copies after Millet, where a younger man told himself that if he learned the grammar of dignity, he might one day write essays of it on his own. She kept drawings as if they were X-rays for later physicians to study. She hung transitions beside triumphs, so you could see how a hand changes its mind. There was a politics to this, and she understood it. Voices that threaten to alter taste are always threatened by dispersal. Turn them into fashionable fragments, and they lose the gravity necessary to bend a culture. Keep them together, and you create a center of mass. When enough gravity gathers, even the unwilling begin to orbit for a minute or two. That is how canons form, without being policed. She had help, of course, conservators who knew which tears needed restitching and which stains to leave alone. Archivists who could read the handwriting of merchants as well as painters. Assistants who could keep schedules when a conversation with a picture risked derailing a day. Friends who told her when her certainty had curdled into stubbornness. A founder is only a founder if she builds a bench for others to sit on and see as well. As the decades shifted, so did the fiercest weather. A building rose at last set in trees with rooms that breathed like lungs. The sequence of galleries did what she had promised herself. It would educate attention. Visitors came as to a pilgrimage. They left not converted to a doctrine but to a practice. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that seeing is a form of care, and care a form of justice, and justice a form of love that does not require a flourish. The museum did not advertise itself as a cathedral for one man, though anyone with eyes could tell which painter had been granted sanctuary. It was a school where Van Gogh was a senior instructor. You could begin at his walls and then walk outward to see the world he made possible, or clarified how other hands learned courage from his impatience, how other colors dared saturation because he had demonstrated it would not break the canvas. You could also walk backward into his influences and see how he was not a meteor but a student among students, respectful where respect was due, stubborn where stubbornness was honest. She taught docents to walk slowly, to ask fewer questions, better to tolerate silence as an interval in which thinking conspires with feeling. She taught guards to be guardians in the sacred sense, visible enough that people behave, invisible enough that people forget to perform. She taught the board that money is a means and mission, the only measure that matters. She taught the government how to talk with founders without mortgaging the future. She taught the paper to write about art without reaching first for the vocabulary of spectacle. There were controversies, because there always are when a standard is real. She acquired a work some thought unbeautiful. She defended a decision some thought unwise. She fired a man who thought he was immovable. She rehired a woman who had been right too early. She accepted that the price of clear convictions is a file of letters that never needed to be answered, and a handful that required a softer reply than your pride wants to write. She learned to apologize on time. History gave her one gift it gives few. She lived long enough to see the good stubbornness bear public fruit. The painter she had risked her reputation on entered the public's heart. His name became a synonym for earnestness under duress. His images, once derided, moved with the velocity of weather across calendars, schoolrooms, and the private museums of people's refrigerators. She watched the danger return. In a new costume fame can commodify as efficiently as disdain. She adjusted curatorial practice to remuster gravity to keep the pictures from dissolving into postcards. A museum can be a bulwark against sentimentality, too. The years made her gentler without making her soft. She allowed in more laughter. She learned which arguments were better as walks. She kept a chair near a window in case the day arrived in a mood that required an extra few minutes of sky. The staff learned to let her have those minutes. The visitors learned by osmosis the tricky art of being present without greed. The local children learned that a museum is not a place for other people. It is a public right, like a park with different weather. She planned her leaving the way she planned: a gallery, clear, sightlines, strong bones, no decorative flourish where it will only collect dust. She negotiated with the state until the structure guaranteed the collection's future instead of merely praising its past. She accepted that institutions are mortal too, then did the work that increases their odds. She wrote not a will so much as a recipe, one that admits substitutions but forbids shortcuts. She believed the next hands would be good, because she had trained them under a kind light. When she died, the museum did not pause, because what would that teach? It did what she had built it to do: opened on time, welcomed without fear, tended rooms where color and charcoal and stone tell the truth politely but without apology. The story of her saving is now in the keeping of those rooms and those who keep those rooms. The painter she protected from dispersal now protects others from it: artists who might otherwise be reduced to fashion, visitors who might otherwise be reduced to consumers, cities that might otherwise be reduced to markets. If you want to understand what she did, do not begin with the inventory. Begin with an ordinary weekday. A bus drops children at the entrance, teachers performing the miracle of counting moving targets. A retiree arrives with a notebook and the quiet urgency of someone who needs the day to matter. A couple plans to finish in an hour and stays for 3. A worker on a break walks in because admission is free, and therefore this building feels like it belongs to him too. Watch how their faces change speed. Watch the way shoulders settle. Watch someone stare longer than they meant to, then look down as if embarrassed to have felt so much in public. That is where the saving happens now. Not in headlines, not at auctions, but at the pace of breath. She did not rescue a man from poverty or madness or fate. That hunger had to be survived or not in the years allotted to him. What she rescued was the integrity of a voice and the conditions in which it can go on doing its finest work, teaching strangers how to look until gratitude starts behaving like courage. The phrase saving Van Gogh can sound grandiose if you say it wrong. Say it as she practiced it, saving as a daily verb. Van Gogh as a proper noun that includes anyone who ever tried to tell the truth with color. Her life offers a map disguised as a story. Begin with attention. Practice it until it becomes a habit paid in minutes, not in money. Acquire only what you are willing to learn from. Keep rooms that dignify the work and the visitor equally. Refuse the manicure of consensus. Protect sequences and contexts because meaning depends on them. Give away as much as you can manage without reducing your ability to keep faith with what remains. Teach as you go. Invite the skeptical. Be patient with the sentimental. Endow light and benches with the same seriousness you endow walls. Write down what you learned and leave it where the next pair of hands will find it without hunting. And when the wind turns and arithmetic arrives like weather, remember what was always true: crises test conviction. If you can hold steady, you discover what you actually believed all along. She believed that the value of a painting is not the number someone will pay for it, but the number of lives it will steady without permission. She believed that museums are not evidence of wealth, but evidence of will, the will to give strangers a place to be more human than the day required. She believed that legacies like collections must be curated with gravity, with humor, where it helps with an unembarrassed respect for what is excellent in us. Walk with that in mind to the room where his colors still behave like weather. Notice how the night is not dark but blue, how yellow is not cheerful but resolute, how a chair can become a portrait when a man paints it as if someone he loves has just stood up from it. Notice how looking slows you until the world fits again. Notice above all that you came to see paintings, and leave having learned something about keeping faith. That, in the end, is what she saved our chance to meet a voice whole. Our chance to be altered by it, not in a rush, not for show, but in the old durable way, quietly, stubbornly, with gratitude, that has learned how to work. A city of boulevards and bells of cafes, where voices braided into a tapestry of gossip and philosophy of ateliers, where the afterglow of impressionism faded into stranger colors. In a home marked more by instruments and notes than by chandeliers, because science, not ceremony, measured the hours there. A daughter was born to Conrad and Pauline Schlumberger. He was an inventor who listened to the earth with wires and mathematics. She, a presence of order and endurance. Their child Dominique would inherit from him the rigor of asking the right question, and from her the quiet strength to carry the answer through storms. No one could know it then, but this girl would grow into a woman who turned art into a keeper of the human soul and a museum into a public conscience. She was raised in the Alsatian Protestant ethos, spare, dutiful, allergic to vanity. Privilege existed in the household, yes, but it was not paraded. It was corralled, taught to behave. From the start, Dominique understood two contradictory truths, that beauty is fragile and that truth is heavier than anyone first suspects. She learned Latin prayers alongside the grammar of light. She felt the hush in chapels and the frank stare of icons. Where other children loved parties, she loved presence, those moments when surface is thin and you glimpse the thing behind the thing. She read widely, listened more widely, and developed a talent rarer than intelligence attention. In 1931 she married Jean de Menil, brisk mind, quick step, a man whose natural habitat was the future. Their marriage was not a merger of fortunes but of directions. Jean was restless, drawn to architecture, cinema, and the logics of building. Dominique was contemplative, yet fiercely decisive, drawn to the unmarketed radiance of artworks that seemed to breathe. Together they began to collect not trophies but touchstones. A Byzantine cross whose gold had been handled soft by centuries of lips. An African mask, still sounding of ritual. A surrealist collage that turned dreams into questions. She did not collect to own. She collected to listen. Then the century broke in half. Fascism spread its cement over Europe. The air filled with marching and lies. The de Menils chose exile. They crossed the Atlantic with their children and griefs and convictions, and arrived not at the center of culture but at its apparent margins, Houston, Texas. An oil city, pragmatic Protestant, rising straight up from the prairie with a kind of athletic certainty, a place where museums were few, galleries smaller still, and modern art an accent many did not understand. Exile clarifies, it strips and sharpens. In Houston, Dominique did not create a salon. She created a sanctuary, one where difference did not merely coexist, but conversed. A Byzantine icon beside a surrealist map of the mind, a Nigerian mask in respectful dialogue with a Picasso who had listened too, a Rothko field of color absorbing and releasing attention like breath. Visitors entered expecting luxury and found intensity. They left with more questions than they brought, and a feeling that questions might be holier than answers. What Dominique was inventing quietly in rooms that never raised their voice was a new grammar of looking, one that insisted that all art is contemporary when you attend to it honestly, and that attention itself is a moral act. She did not segregate. She refused the museum habit of ranking culture's centuries' skin. Her juxtapositions were not provocations for their own sake. They were recognitions. She believed the sacred is not a style, but a depth, and that depth can reside in an icon's gold, a mask's wood, a photograph's silver, a canvas's color. To hang them together was not to confuse categories, but to correct them. The city watched. Some admired, some bristled. Houston's wealth wanted art to flatter the dinner hour, not to interrogate it. But history, especially American history, was interrogating itself. The civil rights movement asked the country whether it believed its own scriptures. Dominique did not pretend neutrality. Neutrality, she would say, is the velvet glove of complicity. She funded photographers who dignified black life instead of extracting it. She supported pastors and professors who argued that segregation was a blasphemy against the image of God. She invited those conversations into her home. She learned to live with the cost. The Vietnam War added its pressure. Rockets rose from pads to moonlight. Body bags returned to kitchen tables. Houston's industries were braided into the war effort. Against that braided certainty, Dominique and Jean hosted a different weave. Scientists, seminarians, artists, and activists at one table, practicing a citizen liturgy of doubt and hope. Art did not distract from politics. In her house, art taught politics how to see. Then came Mark Rothko. The paintings hardly pictured anything, and yet they showed almost everything. Fields of colour as large as weather hues that swallowed and yielded the eye by turns, edges that hovered like thresholds. Standing before them, Dominique recognized a form of prayer that had no creed, but still had faith. She and Jean imagined a room where those canvases could do their work without being asked to behave like pictures. Not a church, not a museum, a chapel. The idea was unreasonable and exactly right. Philip Johnson sketched and argued. Rothko balked at theatrical geometry. The project changed hands. Grief arrived early. Before the building was complete, Rothko ended his life. Dominique's sorrow did not harden into monumentality. It softened into care. The room that opened in 1971, a low octagon light filtered from above, 14 paintings that seemed to drink illumination and return it as interior weather has altered the world's definition of what a cultural space can be. People enter and weep, or they grow still, or they leave and return. One learns there that silence is not the absence of speech, but the presence of meaning. The Rothko Chapel is an argument made without sentences. It proves that art can hold a public together without telling them what to think. It is also, as Dominique designed it, to be a pulpit for the voiceless. Desmond Tutu stood there. The Dalai Lama, Jimmy Carter, mothers whose children were taken by state or hunger, activists whose only armor was truth. The chapel taught Houston that listening is a civic act. But a chapel by design is a concentrate. Dominique wanted a landscape. The collection had outgrown crates and memory. It needed a neighborhood. She commissioned Renzo Piano not to build a temple, but to plant a field of quiet buildings, white clapboard, modest-scale louvers that sifted the Texas sun into kindness. In 1987, the Menil collection opened as if it had always been there, like a sentence you suddenly realize you've been saying your whole life. Admission was free. Labels were accurate, but not bossy. Rooms were sized like confidences. The sequence did not flatter pedigree. It asked for humility. A reliquary and a surrealist collage could share a wall because reverence and risk have always shared a spine. Here, the museum ceased to be a warehouse for valuables and became a school for seeing. It argued not with polemic, but with light, that dignity is indivisible. Here, a visitor could feel their own mind change temperature and their own breath slow. Here you learned that to look well is already to act justly, because justice begins in granting the other their full reality. Dominique curated with conscience. She did not pursue blockbusters. She pursued awakenings. She made rooms for artists shut out of grander rooms. She asked exhibitions to be more than events. She asked them to be testimony. She was allergic to institution speak and to the philanthropy of self-congratulation. When donors wanted their names louder than the art, she shook her head. When a show courted sensation without substance, she cut it cleaner and truer. Her standard was not attendance but attention, not market heat but moral temperature. And audiences responded, students finding a third place that wasn't a mall or a sanctuary but somehow both, elders returning weekly to practice the medicine of silence, neighbors who had never been told they belonged in a museum learning that they did. Her reach lengthened beyond Houston's grid. With Jimmy Carter, she established the Carter Mental Human Rights Prize, because prizes redirect light. She wanted the spotlight aimed not at famous institutions but at tireless lives, lawyers in prison countries, journalists who kept their notebooks open when the power went out, nurses who smuggled medicine past curfews, priests who refused the liturgy of fear, artists who carved, wrote, filmed, and sang their peoples awake. If money could travel faster than witness, she would put them on the same plane. She wrote letters. She traveled. She listened. Václav Havel taught her the courage of the playwright. Desmond Tutu taught her the ferocity of forgiveness. Liberation theologians taught her that sacraments not accompanied by solidarity are only theatre. She had the habit of asking one more question than politeness required, and of waiting 3 seconds longer than comfort allowed. People told her the truth. Her own truths multiplied but did not scatter. She believed first that art is not a department of luxury but the body's memory of freedom. Second, that museums must be hospitable to the poor, to the uncredentialed, to the schoolchild and the widow, and the undocumented neighbor. Third, that a collection is not a menu but a conversation, and conversations grow docile if all the voices sound the same. Fourth, that wealth must repent and be baptized as service, or it will corrode its owners and their cities. Fifth, that silence rightly practiced is not withdrawal, but attention at full strength. She never denied the contradictions in her story. Oil money paid for the louvers that made the light so gentle. Exile paid for her empathy. Grief paid for the chapel's gravity. She refused to tidy any of it. Instead, she let the contradictions instruct her. If privilege cannot become a platform, it will become a prison. If suffering does not make you gentler, it will make you hard and clever. If art does not risk scandalizing fashion, it will be neutralized into furniture. In the Menil campus, she extended her argument through rooms with their own hearts, a gallery for Cy Twombly, where language frays and becomes music, a home for Byzantine frescoes rescued from destruction, because sometimes the ethics of display begin with smuggling what is holy out of harm's path, and end with returning it when safety is real. Outdoor spaces that did not preen grass, that carried the burden of quiet footfall oaks that sermonized in shade. Students came. So did curators suspicious of modesty, and donors suspicious of free admission. Many left converted. The building itself was an essay against swagger. It insisted, be clear, be kind with the sun, be slow, be low to the ground, be porous to the neighborhood, be as precise as a prayer without making a spectacle of reverence. In an era when museums were hired to be skyline jewelry, this campus elected to be a lung. Her last decade did not diminish her ambition. It purified it. She spoke more often about responsibility than about art, and then you realize the words were synonyms. Responsibility is just art practiced in public. She worried about what would happen when she was gone, not about the prestige of her name, but about the thyroid of her institutions. Would some future executive flatten the juxtapositions back into categories? Would fashion dress itself up as relevance? Would the free door start charging? She built guardrails into governance and culture boards that understood the mission, policies that protected openness. A fierce memory in staff who had learned their craft by watching her walk slowly through a room and take 2 minutes with an object everyone else gave 6 seconds. When she died at the end of 1997, Houston discovered that a city can feel orphaned without losing its mother tongue. The chapel did not close its eyes. The museum did not raise its voice. They both kept doing what she had trained them to do: hold space, keep faith with attention, tell the truth about the human, resist the glamours of spectacle and despair alike. Artists remembered a patron who did not shop for them but stood with them. Activists remembered a friend who did not schedule their urgency but amplified it. Pastors, rabbis, imams, monks, and non-believers remembered a woman who believed in sanctuaries without gatekeeping. What remains now is more than legacy. It is a method. The method starts with how one enters a room, unhurried, curious and emptied of pretense. It continues with how one arranges a room so the eye must travel across time and culture without the crutch of superiority. It continues with how one uses a room to host vigils when the city is bleeding, lectures when the city is confused, celebrations when the city remembers how to be kind. It ends nowhere because conscience does not end. On numerous afternoons, a visitor will sit in the Rothko Chapel and experience a physics of tenderness. The dark panels are not black. They are a deep grammar of color that memory recognizes before language does. People cry there not because they are sad, but because they are permitted to be human without performance. They leave steadier. Later that day, the same visitor might step into a Menil gallery and discover an African mask whose dignity is older than their country, a medieval crucifix that insists suffering can be transfigured but not denied a surrealist assemblage, that greets their anxious century like a mirror that does not flatter and therefore can finally help. They will walk back into Houston light feeling unusually usefully awake. Dominique called that awakening the point. Beauty divorced from justice turns narcotic. Justice divorced from beauty turns thin and cruel. Put them in one room and ask them to share the same light, and citizens come out. Citizens not consumers, not fans, not followers. Citizens whose senses have been educated toward patience and whose hearts have been sobered toward courage. If a museum cannot do that, it is only an expensive closet. The Carter Menil Prize continues to redirect the spotlight. Names you have not heard become names you cannot forget. Small organizations with ragged budgets prove again that the human is larger than the state. The prize ceremonies never feel like galas, they feel like baptisms. People leave damp with purpose. Meanwhile, the Menil neighborhood is a proof of concept that resists datafication. Property values rise, of course, but the more important measure is unmeasurable, a radius of kinder walking, children who grow up with the instinct to lower their voice in a room because the room is telling them the truth. Couples who visit not to check a box but to catch their breath. Elders who find a bench that gives back strength. Dominique's argument with the world has aged well. Museums still flirt with spectacle. Boards still use galleries to launder reputations. Markets still mistake price for significance. Yet the chapel and the collection keep offering a different economy of attention, of courage, of humility. They are not antidotes. You cannot live inside them forever, but they are inoculations. They teach the body how to recognize the virus of indifference and how to refuse infection. If you were to translate her life into a small set of sentences, they might be these: look longer, arrange mercy, spend your privilege until it turns into neighborliness, never confuse the quiet with the weak. Learn the names of the people whose names never appear on the museum wall. Hang a mask beside a master to cure yourself of arrogance. Give the sun a job description. Make space for weeping, and call it public service. When the powerful ask for neutrality, offer hospitality to the powerless instead. Train your eyes and your city will follow. And if you need one last sentence, let it be this: build rooms that tell the truth, and then trust those rooms to raise the dead parts of us. Dominique de Menil did not collect to accumulate. She collected to compose. She did not found institutions to secure a name. She founded them to secure a practice, seeing as a civic virtue, silence as a common resource, conscience as a public utility. She believed that a museum could become a place where a city rehearses the better kind of life. In Houston, that rehearsal goes on day after bright day, night after tender night, because one woman chose attention over vanity and arrangement over applause. The world will keep making its noise. The market will keep issuing its commands. The next crisis will arrive loudly, with reasons to hurry and to harden. The chapel will be open. The doors at the Menil will be free. The light will still be kind. The juxtapositions will still be honest. And if we stand there long enough, we will remember what she never forgot, that art is the last place where a society can learn to see itself clearly without first composing a defense. And if seeing leads to loving, and it often does given time and trust, then the museum has already done its political work, its spiritual work, its human work. It has remade appetite into attention and attention into care. It has reminded us that the opposite of indifference is not outrage but devotion. Dominique's life viewed whole redraws a map. Paris gives a language. Exile supplies a compass. Houston provides ground. Science gives the habit of precision. Theology gives the habit of humility. Art gives the habit of wonder. Injustice gives the obligation to act. She braided those habits into institutions that do not behave like monuments. They behave like teachers. So return as often as you can. Sit until the color begins to speak. Walk until the sequence begins to make a sentence you can carry home. Bring a friend who has never been told they belong in a museum. Let the room do the telling. Practice the liturgy of the unhurried look. When you leave, let your next errand be gentler than it would have been. This is how a museum becomes conscious, not by scolding, not by dazzling, but by cultivating the human appetite for reality and then refusing to betray it. And if you must name her legacy in one image, choose this: a visitor who did not expect to be moved, sitting in a quiet room in a busy city, breathing more slowly than usual, startled to find themselves forgiven, then standing, walking out into the light and deciding without drama, without slogan, to be braver and kinder than the afternoon required. That is a good day for a museum. That is a good day for a city. That is the day Dominique spent her life preparing. Imagine walking into the icon room at Hillwood. Gold shimmers in the light enamel, seems to breathe. On their pedestals, 2 imperial Fabergé eggs gleam like punctuation marks in a long story about time, power, and will. How did these treasures, once the pride of the Russian court, end up in a Washington mansion? And how did one woman born into American industry transform herself into the guardian of an exiled empire's art? Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post. To many, she was simply the serial heiress daughter of C.W. Post, who built Postum into the foundation of General Foods. She was born in 1887, raised in wealth and destined to be one of the richest women of her time. But Marjorie's legacy is not only measured in dollars or company shares. Her true argument was visual. She chose to let her life be written in porcelain gold and enamel in rooms filled with objects that told the story of vanished courts and displaced empires. The turning point came in the late 1932. Her third husband, Joseph E. Davis, was appointed United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. That meant Marjorie was living in Moscow during one of history's strangest transactions. The Soviet government, desperate for foreign currency, began selling off the treasures of the Romanovs. Palaces were emptied, Icons, silver, enamels, jewelry, all stripped from churches, aristocratic mansions and imperial storehouses, were quietly placed on the market. For most foreigners, these objects were curiosities. For Marjorie, they were destiny. She had already trained her eye on French decorative arts, collecting Sèvres porcelain and 18th-century treasures. When she saw the Russian objects, she recognized their quality instantly. This was not random shopping, it was a strategy. She had access through her diplomatic position. She had timing buying at the very moment masterpieces were set in motion. And she had taste, the ability to see how Russian craftsmanship echoed and rivaled the French. Piece by piece, she brought them home. Among them were 2 Fabergé imperial Easter eggs, the 12 monograms egg of 1896 made for Empress Maria Feodorovna, and the Catherine the Great egg of 1914 celebrating Russia's most powerful empress. These were not trinkets. They were relics of sovereignty, symbols of faith and power, forced into exile. And now they lived in Marjorie's hands. But the collection did not stop at jewelry. It grew into nearly 90 Fabergé works alongside icons, silver services, court gifts, and hundreds of objects that once defined the language of Imperial Russia. She was not the only collector, but she was the one who would make a museum of it. In 1955, she purchased Hillwood Estate in Washington, D.C. To the outside eye, it was just another grand mansion. To Marjorie, it was a stage. She curated it as both her residence and her blueprint for a future museum. Every room had a role. The French porcelain room demonstrated her training in proportion and finish. The icon room rephrased that training in Russian gold enamel liturgical splendor, all set as if the Orthodox court had been reassembled in Washington. Hillwood was not decoration. It was an argument. Marjorie knew her role was temporary. She believed herself a custodian, not an owner. Her plan was to give Hillwood to the Smithsonian to ensure it would live on as a museum. When that arrangement failed, her foundation stepped in. In 1977, 2 decades after she purchased the estate, Hillwood opened to the public. A private home became a civic institution. Her vision became real. So what do these objects mean beyond their beauty? They tell us about the mechanics of power, a government selling its past, dealers translating value across borders, collectors anchoring displaced culture in new settings. It is soft power in reverse. Not a nation sending art abroad, but a citizen creating a stage so exiled culture could still be seen. The lesson is clear. Timing is leverage. When history releases its treasures, someone must preserve them before they vanish. A house can be a museum. When designed with intention, rooms can argue, not just decorate. And most importantly, collections reach maturity only when the front door opens. A treasure hoarded is a story silenced. A treasure shared becomes a story retold. Stand again in the icon room. Look at the Fabergé eggs glowing under glass. They are not just art objects. They are markers of diplomacy, commerce, and taste. They chart a journey from the palaces of St. Petersburg through the storerooms of the Soviet state, across the Atlantic, and into a Washington mansion where the public can still see them today. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not simply buy, she built. She built a house, a museum, and above all, a promise that the treasures of an empire would not disappear into private vaults. That beauty, even when torn from its homeland, could still speak. And that one woman's vision could turn exile into permanence. Pause, soft close. In the shimmer of enamel and gold, in the silence of Hillwood's rooms,